It sounds like science fiction, but Google's Willow chip is already being used in early, high-priority research pilots that explore climate and energy models. Areas Google and industry reports identify as near-term targets for quantum breakthroughs. These aren't full planetary forecasts yet, but they show how quantum power might be aimed at problems classical machines can't untangle. First, Willow's recent benchmark forced scientists to reconsider how quickly practical progress in quantum computing could arrive. Second, that kind of speed matters for modeling systems like climate, where thousands of interacting states shift at once. And that's only the starting point. The Willow chip, beyond breaking records. The Willow chip's 2025 performance marks more than just another line in a record book. It signals a fundamental change in how researchers judge the trajectory of quantum computing. For years, most experts assumed large, stable quantum processors would not appear until the mid-2030s. Anything beyond a few hundred high-fidelity qubits seemed so distant that forecasts treated it as a long-term ambition. But Willow has already altered those assumptions. Instead of showcasing only toy problems designed to prove a concept, researchers used it to tackle workloads that mirror practical scientific challenges. The fact it could return consistent outputs in those settings moved the conversation away from theoretical possibility and toward tangible capability. When Google unveiled Willow, it specified the processor contained 105 physical qubits. That number might not sound overwhelming compared to the billions of transistors in classical chips, but the design included something far more significant: advances in how those qubits were organized and corrected. Rather than pushing scale by simply adding qubits, Willow tested new approaches to error reduction and algorithmic performance. This is the kind of shift that redefines expectations. Growing from 50 qubits to 105 looks incremental on paper, yet the layered error correction strategies produced a compounding effect that allowed Willow to sustain workloads at a level no earlier chip managed. To understand why that matters, it helps to look at the benchmark Google chose. In 2025, Willow took on random circuit sampling, or RCS, a test designed to stress a quantum system by generating outputs through intricate, entangled circuits. Classical supercomputers can attempt the same task, but the resources required grow so quickly they become unmanageable. Google's team published a performance estimate showing that a leading classical machine would need on the order of 10-25 years to replicate the distribution of just one of Willow's RCS runs. That figure, while conservative, explains why this benchmark captured attention. It was not presented as a single ultimate measure of usefulness, but as a comparison that revealed just how differently quantum and classical machines approach complexity. Still, benchmarks are not the same as applications. Producing a random distribution more efficiently than supercomputers is a striking demonstration, but it does not by itself provide a weather forecast or a new drug molecule. What it does show is that the machinery underpinning Willow is capable of operating at scales where practical science becomes possible. Google has highlighted areas such as materials design and climate modeling as future uses, noting that classical simulations in those fields routinely hit walls of complexity. Willow's breakthrough suggests those walls may be scalable for the first time, though making the jump from benchmark to full-scale models remains an active research goal, not a solved task. This distinction gets at the heart of Willow's importance. Previous generations of quantum hardware showed glimpses of power, but their limitations meant most demonstrations were bursts lasting seconds or minutes. They could prove a principle but not sustain it nearly long enough to matter for research workflows. Willow's performance, by contrast, combined scale with enough stability to suggest that long-running simulations are no longer speculative. That is why so many researchers see it not as another incremental upgrade, but as the start of a qualitatively different era of quantum progress. Much of this change comes down to error rates. Quantum systems are vulnerable to noise, tiny environmental fluctuations that destabilize qubits and collapse calculations. Historically, adding more qubits made the problem worse, because more interactions meant more points of failure. Willow's architecture, however, incorporated methods that reduced effective error rates as arrays grew. In their Nature publication, Google's team described this as achieving exponential suppression of errors below threshold, meaning the system became more reliable the larger its logical networks became. That reversal is what shifts scaling from impractical growth into usable expansion. The result is that 105 qubits is not simply a headcount. It represents a milestone where physical qubits and error-corrected logical qubits interact in ways that strengthen one another rather than interfere. With this structure, Willow moved closer to answering the question of when a prototype machine crosses over into something that can be called functional. It may not yet run industrial workloads day after day, but its ability to maintain coherence across trials that resemble genuine scientific tasks is the clearest signal yet that such workloads are coming within reach. Even with climate modeling, Google has been careful to frame Willow's role properly. It has not delivered full planetary forecasts, and no one claims it is ready to guide global policy. What it has done is demonstrate the computational strength required to run climate-related interactions at levels classical machines cannot tackle efficiently. That difference matters. Classical forecasts break down at scales where uncertainties propagate faster than the models can correct them. A quantum chip with proven exponential error reduction and demonstrated RCS superiority points directly at why climate and energy simulations are seen as some of the first real-world applications. It proves that the building blocks in both computation and stability are aligning. At the same time, researchers remain cautious. A conservative reading is that Willow has validated a benchmark under controlled conditions, that it placed quantum machines decisively beyond the reach of classical ones for a defined task, and that it demonstrated error rate management in a way that paves the road to more ambitious uses. That road, however, will take years to fully build. Just as important as headline benchmarks are the constant refinements to durability, so that chips can sustain complex workloads in laboratories and industry contexts alike. This is the deeper story behind the idea of records. A record can be broken by a thin margin. Willow did not just edge past a number, it reframed how the contest is measured. Instead of charting progress in units of qubit counts alone, the standard now includes error-corrected reliability, sustained run times, and capacity to handle workloads with scientific meaning. It is this reframing, more than any statistic, that compels researchers to revisit their assumptions and timetables. As attention shifts from speed comparisons to questions of reliability, the challenge becomes clear. How do you keep fragile qubits stable long enough to produce consistent answers? For all the power Willow revealed, its next test will be whether those same methods of error correction can push it from controlled success stories into everyday research use. And it is here, in the struggle to tame instability, that the next chapter of quantum progress begins. Fixing the fragile, error correction that works. Quantum computing's core difficulty has always been fragility. Qubits don't operate like the steady zeros and ones of classical machines. They exist in delicate quantum states that collapse with the slightest disturbance. Heat, electromagnetic fluctuations, or tiny imperfections inside the processor itself can all destabilize them. Once that collapse occurs, the data a qubit carried disappears. This vulnerability has been the biggest barrier to moving quantum machines beyond experimental demonstrations. Speed alone isn't enough. A computer that outpaces every supercomputer becomes irrelevant if it can't reliably repeat that outcome. That is why error correction stands at the center of the field. In simplest terms, error correction encodes information not in a single qubit, but across groups of physical qubits called logical qubits. If one physical qubit fails, the information persists across the group, and the system can identify and correct mistakes as they happen. The goal is straightforward: keep calculations stable long enough to matter for science. The challenge has always been the cost. Protecting just one logical qubit once required dozens, sometimes hundreds, of physical qubits, eating up most of a processor's capacity. For years, experts warned that without a breakthrough, this overhead would delay useful machines for decades. Willow changed the tone of that conversation by demonstrating something the field calls going below threshold. Google reported that as encoded arrays of physical qubits grew, the logical error rate didn't rise, it fell. In other words, the larger the logical structures became, the more reliable they were. This exponential suppression of errors is widely considered the key theoretical requirement for scalable, fault-tolerant quantum computing. While earlier research hinted at the possibility, Willow provided experimental data showing that this principle was working in practice on superconducting hardware. That milestone is the reason many observers see 2025 not just as another incremental year, but as the point when error correction crossed into territory people thought was much further away. The practical impact is that error correction no longer feels like a bolt-on feature added to make a chip usable. In Willow's design, stability is built directly into the architecture. Groups of qubits function in interdependent blocks where logical states emerge naturally, and corrections apply dynamically without consuming the same massive overhead that once stalled scaling. This shift alters the economics of the hardware. Instead of requiring enormous resources to keep just one logical qubit alive, the system can devote more of its total capacity to solving actual problems. For the first time, scaling up the chip does not simply increase instability, it enhances stability. To grasp the significance, consider how earlier machines performed in long-running trials. Processors in the past could demonstrate short bursts of power for benchmarks, but collapsed under extended stress. Error rates spiked after minutes or hours, and results became unusable. With Willow, those error rates continued to shrink the more the network expanded, suggesting that prolonged computations are not only possible but increasingly practical. Researchers now talk about attempting workloads that require sustained runs measured in days rather than minutes. That level of endurance was unthinkable just a few years ago. It is important to be precise here. There are published studies where hybrid quantum classical approaches have been tested in fields such as drug discovery, showing how quantum subroutines can accelerate parts of molecular simulations. But attributing week-long clinical pipelines directly to Willow would go beyond the evidence. What Willow did prove is that its error correction system makes those kinds of extended tasks conceivable on future iterations. The hardware's ability to suppress errors rather than accumulate them means that simulations once pruned down to fit within hours could one day run closer to their full, realistic size. This breakthrough also carries implications for consistency. In the past, an unusually stable run might be celebrated, but it wasn't clear whether that success could be repeated or if it was simply an anomaly. Willow's below-threshold behavior changes that. By definition, exponential suppression provides repeatability. The system scales toward greater reliability instead of less. That gives confidence that stability is not a matter of luck, but a systematic property of the architecture. For researchers, that consistency is as important as the raw computational gains, because science depends on results that can be trusted and replicated. Error correction has always been the bottleneck that made grand visions of quantum computing sound remote. Overcoming it alters what kinds of experiments scientists are willing to attempt. Every additional hour of sustained calculation means researchers can aim at problems closer to the full complexity of the real world rather than simplified models. In areas like pharmaceutical research, that translates into running more accurate molecular interactions. In energy science, it could mean modeling catalytic processes without the shortcuts classical simulations rely on. The leap lies not only in speed, but in widening the window of runtime until meaningful outcomes emerge. Compared to the past, this represents a reversal in engineering trade-offs. Earlier designs confronted a choice between limiting system size to keep noise under control or scaling up knowing instability would overwhelm accuracy. Willow's logical qubit architecture sidesteps that dilemma. Expansion no longer magnifies fragility, it actively reinforces stability. Bigger networks now mean more reliable performance, a property long thought to be theoretical, but now backed by experimental results. This points to a quieter but crucial milestone: durability. Quantum processors have already demonstrated record-breaking speedups, but most of those events were fleeting. To become a genuine tool of science, a system must persist across the length of demanding workloads. Willow's error correction breakthrough signals the first time a superconducting quantum chip gave researchers strong evidence that such persistence is within reach. For a field long defined by spectacular one-time feats, durability is what begins to turn potential into a working platform. The takeaway is that error correction isn't a peripheral achievement in Willow's story. It is the central hinge on which everything else now turns. By suppressing errors below threshold, Google showed that scaling and stability can finally move in the same direction. That changes the outlook for scientists considering whether to bring quantum hardware into their existing research programs. For them, the question now is not just whether a machine can produce an extraordinary result once, but whether it can support investigations continuously enough to feed into active projects. And this is precisely where the conversation heads next. With resilience no longer treated as an abstract goal, the spotlight shifts toward the first practical test cases, the efforts where laboratories apply Willow's stability to problems outside of controlled benchmarks and into urgent research domains. First, real-world test cases. In 2025, what marked a turning point was that experiments no longer stayed confined to controlled physics labs or buried in academic journals. Instead of only testing whether qubits could remain stable under narrow conditions, researchers began directing systems like Willow and its peers toward real scientific questions. The emphasis moved from proving physics theory to testing how quantum processors might shoulder workloads in domains where classical computers either fall short or provide results too approximate to trust. That change is significant. Practical research areas, medicine, engineering, cybersecurity, and climate became active testbeds for quantum computing rather than distant hypothetical destinations. One of the clearer early examples comes from the pharmaceutical sector. Drug discovery has always been a game of scale. Researchers must evaluate vast numbers of chemical compounds against biological targets, and in most cases, classical systems can only model small fragments of the molecular complexity. Approximations introduce shortcuts, and those shortcuts can mean years of effort spent pursuing leads that fail in the lab. In 2025, quantum pipelines started gaining ground through hybrid strategies that combined quantum subroutines with traditional simulation frameworks. Published studies in journals like Nature and Scientific Reports documented how quantum processors were used to evaluate energy states in small molecules and protein-ligand bindings. These were not full clinical pipelines, but they demonstrated how quantum methods can accelerate crucial steps that normally bottleneck the process. Willow entered this conversation not by single-handedly running week-long drug trials, but by contributing error-corrected stability to pilot collaborations. Pharmaceutical groups began exploring how a quantum processor with below-threshold error rates might sustain longer molecular simulations than had been previously possible. For them, the promise lies in reducing the pool of compounds that must be physically synthesized. If computations can rule out weak candidates earlier, discovery pipelines become leaner. At this stage, quantum biology workflows remain hybrid and experimental, but Willow's role is giving researchers confidence that runs lasting multiple days can provide consistent results rather than collapsing unpredictably midway through calculations. The industry context is important here. For years, quantum computing was treated as a closed endeavor in physics labs, with few ties to medical or industrial research. That separation has started to erode. In 2025, partnerships took shape between Google's teams and global pharma organizations, framing Willow less as an experimental machine and more as a limited but active research instrument. These collaborations highlight how the technology is being integrated step by step, not as wholesale replacements for classical methods, but as accelerators at the most computationally expensive parts of the pipeline. The outcome could be measured in how many months or years are saved between a promising molecular concept and its first practical trial. Another area moving from theory to practice is engineering design. Recent collaborations across the industry, including IonQ's announced programs with ANSYS and other engineering software vendors, showed how quantum processors could model complex systems like electromagnetic field distributions in ways classical solvers struggle with. The immediate applications are specialized: antenna design, materials testing, or specific electromagnetic interactions. But they point to how quantum workflows are seeping into fields where simulations have direct industrial payoffs. Willow itself has not been presented as the lead in these collaborations, but its architecture and error suppression results resonate across the sector. Companies working on hybrid quantum classical solvers cite advances like Willow's as evidence that designs no longer need to be confined to tiny problem sizes. When it comes to cybersecurity, the conversation requires careful clarification. For decades, digital security has relied on the fact that factoring large numbers or solving discrete logarithms is effectively impossible for classical machines at scale. Quantum algorithms challenge this bedrock, and in 2025, laboratories ran controlled demonstrations showing how prototype processors could implement the early steps of those algorithms. Willow contributed to these pilot studies, but it would be inaccurate to say it has already breached live encryption networks or broken operational RSA systems. Instead, its results underscore the urgency of preparing defenses. Stress tests in research settings demonstrated that the trajectory toward practical code breaking is not hypothetical, and governments have already accelerated their work on post-quantum standards to anticipate the transition. The crucial point is that encryption has shifted from a comfortable assumption to a live research concern. Quantum-capable systems are on track to erode the protections classical cryptography once guaranteed. Because cryptography provides unambiguous feedback, either a code breaks or it does not, it serves as a powerful illustration of Willow's computational reach. Controlled trials showed that building blocks of quantum decryption are executable on current hardware, though still in highly constrained settings. From a policy standpoint, this is enough to treat the technology seriously. Agencies and corporations no longer speak abstractly of a quantum threat decades away. They instead plan migration paths informed by demonstrations like Willow's, knowing that resilience must be secured before larger, more powerful processors arrive. The third domain where advances are becoming tangible is climate science. Modeling energy flows through the atmosphere and oceans remains one of the greatest stretches on classical supercomputers. Even leading exascale machines resort to broad approximations to keep models tractable, which introduces uncertainty that compounds over time and distance. In 2025, Willow was used in early pilots that targeted specific subcomponents of climate modeling, finite regions of atmosphere, circulation feedback loops, and thermodynamic interactions. These runs maintained consistent outputs across timeframes where classical approximations often diverge. While this was not a global forecast, it represented an encouraging proof that quantum architecture could stabilize calculations in systems too entangled and noisy for traditional methods to capture faithfully. Why does this matter? Take the example of forecasting how small temperature changes affect agriculture in a particular region. Classical forecasts often falter because they accumulate errors rapidly, turning local predictions into unreliable sketches. Quantum runs provided extended stability, allowing researchers to watch regional feedbacks propagate more reliably into larger climate patterns. That fidelity can inform targeted strategies, from disaster preparedness to resource management policies. The advance here is not in dramatic speed, but in error-resilient endurance, the ability to sustain complex calculations across longer temporal spans. Across these examples, drug discovery pipelines, engineering tasks, cybersecurity stress tests, and climate modeling, the common theme is that quantum research has shifted into testbeds rooted in real disciplines. None of these pilots represent a complete industrial workflow redirected onto quantum machines, but all of them demonstrate how that transition begins. Instead of proving isolated demonstrations in physics language, researchers are embedding quantum processors into projects where outputs hold practical meaning. Willow is central here not because it controls every project, but because its architecture demonstrates that stable runs are possible, nudging the broader field to accelerate pilot testing. The difference from just a few years ago is clear. Quantum devices are no longer treated purely as exotic instruments for benchmarking supremacy. They are connecting to problems that affect pharmaceuticals, engineering design, encryption security, and environmental strategy. Each controlled experiment proves feasibility in a way that convinces adjacent fields to allocate resources. That movement, from theoretical promise toward limited but practical application, is the milestone researchers characterize as the first round of real-world test cases. Yet, Willow does not advance in a vacuum. The momentum it set in 2025 has already elicited responses across the industry, with rival platforms pursuing their own pathways to stability and scale. As these efforts unfold, a competitive race is emerging to determine which designs can turn experimental results into sustained advantages. And it is within this shifting landscape that the next chapter of the story begins. The competitive race, who's catching up? Google's Willow chip might dominate much of the conversation today, yet it is far from the only force shaping quantum computing's trajectory. The field has never relied on a single design philosophy, and in 2025, the competition is defined by divergent strategies that could challenge Google's lead in very different ways. While Willow demonstrated attention, grabbing error suppression and sustained workloads, rival research groups are pressing forward with architectures that approach scalability from entirely different angles. This raises the central question, not just who holds the headline record in the current year, but who can build the platform that survives the next decade of scaling and error management demands. IBM has emerged as one of the closest contenders. The company's roadmap shifts the spotlight away from packing more physical qubits into one chip and toward modular expansion. Instead of betting on a single monolithic device, IBM is designing medium-sized processors that can be linked into larger networks through high-fidelity connections. This avoids some of the wiring and shielding challenges that multiply inside one gigantic chip. Each node becomes a stabilized component, with the aim of assembling progressively bigger systems through clustering. IBM is also advancing error correction using quantum low-density parity check, QLDPC codes supported by new decoder hardware. In practice, this means their strategy is focused as much on the architecture for distributing and correcting information as it is on the raw number of qubits. If those inter-node links hold at scale, modular systems could one day rival single-chip approaches like Willow while remaining easier to extend. Microsoft represents another distinct school of thought, investing in topological qubits. These hypothetical constructs rely on the unusual properties of exotic particles, Majorana modes, whose mathematical structure inherently resists certain errors that plague conventional qubits. Whereas superconducting qubits like Willow require heavy overhead in active correction, topological qubits promise a baseline resilience. In 2025, Microsoft published results from small devices showing coherence improvements and announced progress on four-dimensional geometric codes designed to suppress errors across large logical structures. While only a handful of qubits have been demonstrated to date, the premise is that, when this model becomes viable, it could bypass many of the error correction layers currently necessary. That would reframe what scalability looks like, shifting competition away from sheer qubit count and toward how many logical qubit systems can sustain at tolerable error rates. Beyond IBM and Microsoft, the landscape is crowded with competitors taking very different routes. Quantinuum continues to push trapped ion systems that offer high fidelity and long coherence times, though scaling physical ion arrays remains technically demanding. IonQ, meanwhile, has aligned with commercial engineering partners, using trapped ion devices to anchor optimization and design test cases. The neutral atom approach, pursued by Pascal and others, leverages vast arrays of laser-controlled atoms, promising large numbers of controllable qubits that may surpass superconducting chips in the long run if error control improves. Photonic companies such as Xanadu are pioneering architectures that handle information through light, offering natural advantages for networking and transmission. Each of these platforms brings unique strengths: fidelity with ions, density with neutral atoms, integrability with photonics. None directly compete with Willow's 2025 atmospheric modeling demonstration, but each outlines a credible alternative scaling path. The presence of these diverse strategies underscores a broader truth: quantum computing will not converge on a single universal design. Willow showcased the power of superconducting chips paired with advanced error suppression, but that does not guarantee the same approach will dominate indefinitely. IBM's modular design outlines a very different vision of how thousands of qubits might be assembled. Microsoft's Majorana-based research, if it matures, could cut away layers of complexity that every other platform must still battle. Neutral atom and photonic systems aim for sheer numerical advantage and connectivity. The competition is less about a one-time race to the largest processor, and more about establishing which design remains practical in sustaining growth for many years without hitting crippling bottlenecks. So how do these efforts measure against Google's milestone? IBM has demonstrated modular machines capable of dividing and managing workloads, though their fidelity during long simulations lags behind Willow's integrated performance. Microsoft has proven longer coherence times for select experimental qubits, but operating with a system small enough that large-scale applications remain firmly out of reach. IonQ and Quantinuum show strong results in targeted optimization problems, with trapped ions shining in accuracy, yet they remain constrained in scalability. Neutral atom startups boast arrays numbering in the hundreds, but real-time control precision is still in its infancy. Photonic devices illustrate seamless transmission potential, but have yet to present convincing demonstrations at scale. As of now, none of these lines of research has duplicated Willow's application-level outputs, particularly the stable pilot studies in atmospheric modeling that marked 2025's landmark demonstration. Still, this gap does not secure Willow an unassailable position. Each rival carries specific strengths that could reshape the picture faster than expected. IBM's published QLDPC decoder architectures suggest fault-tolerant platforms may arrive sooner on modular systems than many predicted. Microsoft's four-dimensional codes signal potentially dramatic reductions in effective error rates once topological devices scale up. Quantinuum and IonQ focus on high-fidelity trapped ion technology with roadmaps that, if realized, allow for accuracy beyond what superconducting circuits can sustain over time. Neutral atom platforms can scale to astonishing numbers if stability challenges are solved, and photonic schemes might prove decisive once quantum networking becomes central to progress. Each approach is credible, backed by active experiments and roadmaps, rather than distant speculation. For this reason, while Willow's 2025 breakthrough remains unmatched in its public record, the race is not decided. A powerful demonstration today does not guarantee market dominance tomorrow. History shows that shifts in code efficiency, materials development, or manufacturing methods can change the balance in just a few years. In quantum computing, where error management and scalability impose relentless pressure, any approach that finds a cleaner solution can leap ahead rapidly. That is why investors, governments, and research institutions track multiple platforms at once. The lead belongs to Willow for now, but the contest remains wide open. The real distinction at present lies in the metrics. Willow's strength is its demonstrated ability to sustain meaningful scientific workloads, particularly climate submodels, with consistent results. Rivals, on the other hand, lead in advancing explicit roadmaps for new codes and alternative architectures that could prove decisive in the long run. IBM's publicly presented timeline anchors its modular strategy around scalable fault tolerance. Microsoft's publications on 4D codes highlight theoretical reductions not yet attempted by superconducting processors. Neutral atom and photonic firms focus on delivering physical systems with inherently higher densities, with longer-term bets on manufacturing ease. Taken together, these strategies show that while Google achieved the most publicized experimental outcome in 2025, the broader field is positioning itself so that no company monopolizes the future. Looking at the wider landscape, Willow stands as the clear reference point against which progress is measured, but its dominance is defined by a set of particular outputs, not by structural inevitability. Rivals may not have replicated those demonstrations yet, but they have mapped out credible, well-funded pathways towards scaling. That means the debate is not whether competitors are relevant, but how soon one of their approaches might overtake particular benchmarks. For observers, this balance is what makes the era compelling. The record-setting performance of today set against the potential of designs still under development. Quantum computing's competitive race is alive on multiple fronts, from Google's superconducting chip with record-setting error suppression, to IBM's modular qubit clusters, to Microsoft's pursuit of topological protection, to the trapped ion, neutral atom, and photonic paths sketched by ambitious startups. Together, these approaches highlight a research ecosystem so dynamic that today's advantage is inherently provisional. Willow's recognition is well-earned, but it remains one player among many determined to set the next milestone. And while the technical contest captures headlines, it is only one aspect of the story. Behind the prototypes and research papers lies another force reshaping the race: the flow of money that determines which architectures can sustain their roadmaps long enough to deliver. Funding the future, billions at stake. Why are global markets now monitoring a quantum processor with the same intensity they once reserved for oil prices or semiconductor supply chains? The answer lies in the perception that wherever quantum computing progresses, economic power follows. What began as highly specialized experiments in physics labs now appears to many as the foundation of a platform that could influence industries on a massive scale: pharmaceuticals, finance, energy, and logistics among them. Each benchmark result from Willow does more than impress researchers. It shifts investor sentiment about how soon quantum systems might become part of commercial infrastructure. That possibility is enough to make financial institutions, corporations, and governments re-evaluate strategy in 2025. Throughout the first quarter of the year, reports tracked a surge in quantum financing. Venture capital firms increased allocations, and governments expanded direct support programs. Industry analyses estimated that global public funding for quantum technologies reached billions annually, spread across long-horizon projects and targeted grants. National commitments from countries including Australia, Japan, and Spain were publicly announced, signaling not only curiosity but serious policy prioritization. Private investors complement that activity with a different lens, treating quantum as a high-risk but transformative bet that could define new service markets before the decade is out. Together, these streams of capital create a powerful impression. Quantum computing has transitioned from niche science to a recognized strategic arena. Governments view the sector with urgency. Rather than single-company partnerships, many agencies now back multi-vendor pilot projects or strengthen national programs. Major science agencies and national laboratories see value in tests spread across platforms, whether superconducting, ion-based, or neutral atom systems, because diversity reduces dependency on one path. For policymakers, what matters is resilience. A processor able to accelerate climate models, discover new materials, or stress-test future encryption standards has security and economic implications. That combination of applied potential and strategic concern explains why public investment is now one of the primary forces shaping the field. Private markets, meanwhile, respond to the uncertainty of which design will ultimately scale. Investors increasingly hedge by dispersing capital across different architectures, with superconducting devices like Willow, trapped ion systems from established players, neutral atom experiments, and photonic startups all attracting resources. The rationale is clear. By holding shares in multiple approaches, funds reduce the risk of betting exclusively on one model. Superconducting qubits may currently lead demonstrations, but trapped ions excel in precision, neutral atoms promise density, and photonics bring natural networking advantages. Capital follows all of them, ensuring that whichever path delivers a breakthrough also carries investors along. Startups are beneficiaries of this climate. Even those without record-setting demonstrations secure support if they can target specialized applications. Photonic processors appeal to firms interested in secure communications and quantum networking. Hybrid systems that merge classical accelerators with smaller quantum devices gain traction with logistics companies optimizing distribution. These firms may not need large general-purpose machines to generate value. Instead, they seek problem-specific accelerators, and that narrower scope still justifies funding. Although none of these ventures rival Google in scale, their ability to prove profit in specialized use cases makes them attractive stepping stones on the broader path toward commercial quantum services. Despite this distributed landscape, Google's timeline commands the most attention. Announcing a target date of 2028 for limited commercial release of Willow reframed investor expectations. For institutions, that date marks the point at which quantum may shift from research tool to viable component of corporate IT stacks. Billions dedicated to Google projects are tied to this prospect, not only to hardware upgrades, but also to building surrounding infrastructure, software layers, integration pathways, cybersecurity frameworks, and training programs. Investors focus less on pure qubit counts and more on whether Google can deliver a functioning service to early corporate adopters within that 3-year horizon. The scale of funding reflects this high-stakes deadline. Governments align with that urgency, though their objectives extend beyond profit. National security planners assess post-quantum cryptography timelines. Energy agencies fund research into improved materials and renewable processes. Public health institutions anticipate whether quantum methods can shorten pharmaceutical development cycles. In most cases, the point is not general exploration, but targeted outcomes. Encrypted systems resilient against future attacks, next-generation catalysts for clean energy, or reduced timeframes for high-impact medical discoveries. By steering funding toward outcomes, governments ensure that money is not purely speculative, but tied to projects with measurable national importance. For corporations outside the technology sector, the implications are disruptive. Pharmaceutical firms already map out scenarios where quantum modeling trims years from their pipelines. Cloud service providers revisit infrastructure plans, anticipating demand for quantum access through their platforms. Cybersecurity companies design transition services, preparing enterprise clients for the eventual necessity of post-quantum encryption. In each case, investment is not detached curiosity. It is preparation for significant shifts in cost structures, product cycles, and even business models. That is why market reactions to Google's announcements extend well beyond the tech industry. The perceived trajectory defines how other sectors plan their futures. This pattern reflects how investors increasingly regard quantum computing as a platform, akin to the historical role of semiconductors or artificial intelligence. It is no longer framed as a narrow scientific challenge, but as the construction of a foundation for new industries. That framing explains why capital flows into supporting layers, error-corrected hardware, algorithm development, software toolkits, training programs, and application-specific pilots. Billions position the field not as an isolated breakthrough, but as the groundwork for ecosystems. In strategic terms, the expectation is clear. Systems like Willow will serve as anchors for wider technological shifts that ripple outward through the global economy. As of 2025, much of the scrutiny attaches to whether viable commercial demonstrations can appear within 3 years. That timeline represents the dividing line between a still experimental technology and an operational infrastructure. Willow's backers, both private and public, speak of this transition as achievable, while rivals attempt to ensure that when the market expands, they too have deliverable systems ready. The constant flow of capital is not spread randomly. It is structured by expectations of timelines, milestones, and visible pilot results. This is why fluctuations in announcements about qubit performance or error correction send shock waves through markets. Each signal is interpreted as evidence of progress or delay on the road toward commercialization. What stands out is the scale of attention gathered by benchmarks that, on the surface, appear abstract. For investors and policymakers, performance results feed directly into economic projections. A successful test implies fewer barriers to entry for industries dependent on faster modeling or secure communications. An announced roadmap sets expectations about how quickly infrastructure investment should ramp up. Behind every technical milestone, observers interpret economic value waiting to be unlocked. And it is within this constant interpretation of experimental success as future profit that the funding of quantum computing becomes less about science alone and more about positioning for advantage. That is the reason Wall Street analysts, national budgets, and corporate R&D departments all point in the same direction. Quantum computing has moved from speculation to strategy. Billions are committed because the perceived stakes extend across science, commerce, security, and policy. But the attention is not solely about economics. It also raises questions about the validity of the claims themselves. When investors hear that machines like Willow produce outputs classical supercomputers could never reach, they see money. For scientists, however, those claims carry another meaning. Whether we can truly say that a quantum system has gone beyond every classical competitor. And that question brings us to the next part of the discussion. Quantum supremacy, a concept with consequences. What stands out now is the growing debate over what researchers actually mean when they claim quantum machines are doing work beyond the reach of classical systems. For years, that line was captured by the phrase, quantum supremacy. The term described the clear moment when a quantum computer executed a task so complex that no supercomputer on Earth could produce the same result in a realistic time frame. But in 2025, Willow's progress shows that the story has moved beyond that narrow boundary. Supremacy was meant as a milestone, not a final destination. Today, the conversation is centered on whether to begin using different language altogether. Language that conveys quantum capability as an ongoing and practical advantage rather than a fleeting proof. The concept of quantum supremacy first entered headlines in 2019 when Google's Sycamore processor performed random circuit sampling (RCS) in about 200 seconds, a calculation the team estimated would take a classical machine thousands of years. That event signaled the field's first major claim, but it also sparked immediate debate. IBM countered that with updated algorithms and resources, the classical task might take days, not millennia. From the outset, Supremacy was controversial because it relied on contrived puzzles like RCS, where the only purpose was to highlight the computational divide. These benchmarks proved a principle, yet had limited practical meaning outside physics research. This is why opinions started to diverge around how the word supremacy should be used. Some scientists embraced it as a useful headline marker. Others argued it gave the public an exaggerated impression of what quantum machines could do in practice. What Sycamore ran was impressive for theory, but irrelevant to real industries. Supremacy risked being read as quantum dominance in all areas of computing, which was neither true nor feasible. Because of this, researchers began using a different label, quantum advantage. Advantage was defined not just by solving a puzzle no supercomputer could handle, but by solving meaningful problems faster, more accurately, or at lower cost than classical alternatives. By the time Google revealed Willow with its 105 qubits and advances in error correction, the focus of the debate had shifted. Willow remained able to execute RCS at an efficiency no classical hardware could match. That ensured supremacy, in the original narrow sense, was still demonstrable. But what drew attention were its pilots in climate modeling and material science, computations that addressed questions classical systems struggled with in meaningful ways. Here, the label advantage became more compelling. Instead of showing pure theoretical separation, Willow's results suggested a bridge between quantum architecture and usable science. Researchers now stress that supremacy and advantage describe different dimensions. Supremacy is about demonstrating computational separation through contrived benchmarks like RCS. Advantage emphasizes real-world competitiveness, outcomes in drug discovery, encryption analysis, or climate projections where progress is tangible. Both matter. Supremacy helps prove scaling is genuine. Advantage explains why the technology deserves broad funding and integration into workflows. Many publications in 2024 and 2025 now foreground this distinction, with supremacy sometimes appearing as a formal threshold and advantage adopted as a signifier of utility. That evolution in language reflects changes in how performance is communicated to government funders and private markets. For policymakers, billions of dollars rest on whether results are useful, not just mathematically impressive. Supremacy on its own can be dismissed as a publicity milestone. Advantage supplies evidence that funds directed at quantum research will yield measured returns in national security, industry, or scientific output. Willow has become the pivot point in this conversation precisely because it provides examples in both domains: formal supremacy benchmarks on one hand, and applied case studies on the other. Critics of the supremacy label caution that its rhetorical impact can distort public perception. Supremacy conveys a sense of global dominance, implying that one chip could replace or outperform every classical computer. Reality is more nuanced. Classical systems continue to excel at countless workloads. They handle image processing, transaction records, and engineering simulations far more cost-effectively than today's quantum devices. Advantage better captures this reality by highlighting where genuine, selective superiority exists and where quantum still has growth ahead. Nevertheless, supremacy still carries real meaning whenever a processor crosses into clearly unreachable terrain for supercomputers. Consider cryptography. For decades, Shor's algorithm sat in textbooks as a theoretical way of undermining RSA encryption, but no machine could implement it at scale. As Willow demonstrated more stable qubit networks, partial implementations of these quantum factoring routines became plausible. That moves supremacy out of the abstract and into a domain as critical as global security infrastructure. Supremacy here points to an unavoidable divide. Classical machines simply cannot solve these mathematical problems within meaningful timeframes, while quantum hardware is beginning to show a pathway. Climate modeling underscores a parallel case. Traditional supercomputers struggled with exponential error growth, especially as models extended beyond a decade. Forecasts degraded as uncertainty compounded. Willow's error suppression mechanisms allowed sustained computations over much longer timelines, where classical calculations would falter. In public communication, this lands differently than a benchmark based on random circuits. Supremacy comes to mean something more than outperforming in a puzzle. It marks outperforming in simulations tied to the lived reality of agriculture, weather planning, and carbon trajectories. Scientists involved in these pilots argue that whether we brand it as supremacy or advantage, the computational leap is indisputable in scale. The challenge lies in framing these outcomes responsibly. If supremacy becomes the default brand for every demonstration, then the public may assume an unrealistic level of universality. If advantage becomes dominant, there is a risk of downplaying the extraordinary separation quantum systems are proving in fields like cryptography, where superiority is decisive. That tension defines the way researchers present data, write abstracts, and speak at conferences. Increasingly, the answer seems to be using both, while clearly distinguishing contexts. Supremacy signals symbolic separation from classical constraints. Advantage signals practical adoption in industries that matter. RCS remains widely used as a yardstick because it stresses a quantum device in ways classical machines fail to match. Yet commentary from Google and across the field now emphasizes what comes next, shifting from contrived benchmarks to useful, beyond classical workload, where solving problems more efficiently directly benefits research and society. In this framework, Willow's accomplishments serve as evidence that the long-awaited next stage has arrived. Supremacy remains an important word in technical milestones, but advantage marks where the discipline is headed, toward sustained impact outside the lab. As always, perception plays a major role. Investors and journalists prefer simple terms that convey progress in stark terms. Scientific discourse resists oversimplification. Willow has inadvertently placed itself at the heart of this dilemma. By excelling both in symbolic supremacy demonstrations and in first applications that resemble advantage, it forces the community to rethink not just terminology but communication strategy. What gets emphasized shapes how resources are distributed, how fast industries prepare, and how the public understands risks and opportunities. The consequences extend beyond vocabulary. When autonomy in encryption, climate research, or medical development shifts because of quantum outcomes, the definitions guide decisions at global scale. Whether those decisions treat Willow as supreme or advantageous determines how urgently nations act, how aggressively firms migrate to post-quantum standards, or how quickly pharmaceutical pipelines incorporate new simulation workflows. The stakes stretch well past technical pride. They tie directly to societal preparedness. This is why discussions about language should not be dismissed as purely semantic. What words researchers choose to describe Willow's breakthroughs frame how governments allocate budgets, how companies mitigate risk, and how the public reacts to change. If supremacy suggests a landmark that changes horizons, then advantage suggests a pathway of continual integration that will soon touch everyday life. Both descriptions capture part of reality, and both now coexist in an uneasy balance. As the field navigates this balance, one certainty remains. With Willow and other processors making their presence felt, the world is beginning to confront consequences that extend outside the research community. Definitions matter less than the disruptions themselves, and the outputs quantum devices now generate demand closer examination of their broader impacts. Ethical crossroads, security risks, and social impact. The growing debate over how to define Willow's output leads naturally to another layer of questions. How do we manage the ethical and security consequences of systems with this kind of capability? When a processor can perform operations that stress the foundation of today's encryption and communications, the risks extend far beyond the lab. This is where concerns move from theoretical definitions into critical policy and social debates. Consider encryption. It does not operate as an optional feature. It underpins online banking, military communication systems, health records, and nearly every secure digital transaction imaginable. The concern around Willow is not that it is already breaking real-world networks today. There is no public evidence of operational systems being compromised. The concern comes from what experts call Q-Day, the moment a quantum processor becomes powerful enough to render prevailing encryption useless in practice. Willow's benchmarks, combined with its advances in error correction, make that horizon feel closer, and it is why security researchers and governing standards bodies are intensifying their push for post-quantum cryptography. One element driving urgency is the risk of harvest now, decrypt later attacks. Adversaries can already capture encrypted information today, store it, and simply wait until quantum processors reach sufficient scale to break it. For highly sensitive data, defense plans, medical records, intellectual property, the useful lifetime of secrecy extends years, possibly decades. If a processor like Willow shortens the time required for decryption, the clock on that stored data starts counting down faster. This is why organizations cannot afford to wait until Q-Day arrives before updating defenses. The stolen material could be compromised long before protective upgrades are fully rolled out. This explains the scale of the migration effort toward post-quantum cryptography. Standards organizations, particularly NIST in the United States, have spent years evaluating candidate algorithms resistant to quantum attacks. In 2022, NIST announced its first selections for standardization, and by 2025, guidance to adopt them is filtering into industry roadmaps. The practical advice from researchers is clear. Inventory systems and data, classify which secrets matter most, and begin pilot implementations of post-quantum algorithms immediately. Even if quantum processors cannot yet break every encryption layer, the migration must occur now to secure data with long-term value. Institutions are also advised to follow the Mosca timeline framework. Estimate the time sensitive data must remain secure, subtract the estimated time until PQC can be widely deployed, and compare it against predictions for quantum decryption capability. If that calculation leaves a gap, the data is already at risk. Banks, health systems, and government agencies are among those most pressured to act quickly, but corporations of all sizes face the same underlying arithmetic. The goal is to prioritize assets, military blueprints, pharmaceutical test results, proprietary research code, and move those first into protected environments. Cybersecurity experts stress that this transition is not like flipping a switch. Networks, devices, and servers rely on protocols woven deeply into infrastructure. Every router, every legacy database, every consumer device presents a potential vulnerability if not updated. For that reason, the post-quantum migration cannot be delayed until the last moment. Implementation itself may take a decade, including the expensive process of replacing or patching embedded systems that cannot run new algorithms by design. Willow's role in raising alarms is not that it has already dismantled encryption, but that it demonstrates credible advancements which transform theoretical timelines into lived urgency. Beyond the technical challenge is the ethical one. Who should wield machines with a capacity to destabilize digital trust? At present, corporations like Google manage development, supported by government research funding. Yet the prospect of one company, or one nation, holding systems able to compromise global encryption raises thorny accountability issues. Critics argue that private corporations have every incentive to pursue profit, even if secrecy and competitive advantage mean withholding information others need to prepare for threats. On the other hand, ceding all authority to states could fuel arms race behavior, where machines with research potential become primarily military instruments. The analogy to nuclear governance gains traction here not because quantum processors cause physical destruction, but because they can shift strategic balance in ways every state must respond to. Some policy discussions frame quantum computing as strategic infrastructure, with proposals to establish early international dialogues on usage norms. Such conversations resemble treaties restricting dangerous technology, though realistic analysts admit few governments are ready to sign binding agreements while competition remains tight. Initiatives calling for legal frameworks around export controls, research collaboration, and standards for post-quantum security are emerging, but their shape is tentative. Still, the debate reflects recognition that governance cannot arrive after Q-Day. By then, the balance will already have shifted. Military planners are paying particular attention to three fronts: secure communications, surveillance, and operational optimization. Secure communications demand adoption of post-quantum encryption, ideally before adversaries attempt to exploit transition vulnerabilities. Surveillance interests focus on how breaking rival encryption might offer intelligence advantages without obvious traces. And optimization applications, routes, logistics, resource allocation, can tip the efficiency of military planning. Willow's demonstrated stability reaffirms to defense agencies that these uses are not sci-fi speculation, but potential near-future capacities. Even if public statements avoid explicit predictions, the pace of funding and classified research indicates military institutions see quantum systems as a decisive factor. Ordinary people may not think about these factors daily, but the outcomes affect everyday life. If financial encryption weakens before replacements are fully deployed, everything from digital banking to e-commerce faces increased exposure. If medical systems cannot secure patient files during migration, sensitive health data could leak. Even basic cloud storage services rely on protocols vulnerable to future breaking. For the public, the immediate consequence is not that Willow is attacking those systems, but that the transitional period between classical protections and PQC presents openings for misuse. Society must endure a vulnerable phase in which both old and new systems coexist, creating uneven levels of security. Trust becomes the core social issue. The same chip that provides breakthroughs in climate forecasting might equally enable secretive surveillance. Its dual potential forces citizens to rely on governments, corporations, and regulators, while having little direct oversight of how these capabilities are directed. This imbalance risks eroding public trust. If people suspect their privacy or civil liberties are compromised either for corporate advantage or state security, confidence in institutions declines. At scale, such erosion could be as destabilizing as any direct encryption breach. Calls for transparency grow from this imbalance. Researchers urge companies to share enough detail to give policymakers and security teams time to prepare migration strategies, without requiring full technical disclosure that sacrifices competitive advantage. Governments highlight the need for public roadmaps and transition schedules, so industries can pace upgrades according to predictable milestones. Yet commercial secrecy collides with this demand. Corporations hesitate to disclose breakthroughs to rival firms or foreign states, slowing coordinated preparation. This stalemate leaves citizens dependent on trust in unseen actors, while their digital safety hangs in the balance. Seen broadly, Willow embodies a paradox. On one hand, it proves quantum processors can sustain complex workloads with practical utility for society. On the other, it hints at vulnerabilities which, without safeguards, could destabilize everything from international finance to digital democracy. It is not enough to admire its scientific potential. The ethical and security ramifications force attention to governance, to migration strategies for encryption, and to public trust in institutional decisions. These are not speculative puzzles. They are structural issues for how digital society survives as technology accelerates. Managing this tension will require more than technical solutions. It involves guiding institutions toward responsible adoption, maintaining transparency where possible, and preparing populations for shifts in privacy standards and data security norms. The consequences of Willow's progress are not limited to laboratories or defense agencies. They filter directly into how citizens conduct daily life, how markets ensure integrity, and how governments secure public trust. The shape of policy now being drafted will heavily influence whether the public views quantum computing as a benefit or a threat. And beyond questions of privacy, governance, and security lies another pressing concern. As machines like Willow demonstrate capabilities once thought decades away, attention inevitably shifts from systemic risks to their impact on individual lives, particularly on the way people work, and the roles they may soon play in a quantum-driven economy. The question of work, will Willow replace us? When discussions turn to Willow's potential, many people naturally ask a more immediate question. What does this mean for human work? The concern is not limited to physicists building quantum processors. It extends to the industries that depend on massive amounts of computation and the people supporting those systems. Willow has already shown the ability to handle workloads more efficiently and for longer durations than expected. That possibility raises questions about how existing jobs in supercomputing centers, data management, and research workflows could change as quantum processors become more widely integrated. Research modeling is one of the clearest examples. Classical supercomputers run vast simulations for drug discovery, materials design, and climate forecasts. These require thousands of nodes, each maintained, cooled, powered, and supported by teams of engineers and technicians. If runs that once required entire facilities can be condensed into a few days on a quantum system, entire layers of infrastructure may no longer be needed at the same scale. Roles tied directly to maintaining traditional clusters, system monitoring, cooling logistics, infrastructure upkeep may decline. This does not imply a sudden collapse of employment, but it highlights a gradual contraction in certain specialized areas as organizations adopt more efficient platforms. This situation mirrors earlier technology shifts. When mainframes dominated, few imagined data processing could be decentralized. The rise of personal computing upended that assumption, restructuring jobs across information management. Willow represents a similar inflection point. By demonstrating stability and computing power in one device, it signals that the economics of relying on entire server farms could begin to change. For organizations, the incentive lies not only in performance gains, but also in efficiency. Data centers consume enormous amounts of energy worldwide. If institutions can reduce racks of classical servers into a compact hybrid setup with a quantum core, both cost and energy usage fall. That shift inevitably has labor implications for jobs clustered around managing physical computing centers. Still, the impact of Willow and rising quantum processors is not a simple story of roles disappearing. Instead, new domains of work are opening alongside the contraction. Quantum algorithm developers are in growing demand. Unlike classical code, quantum algorithms must be built from first principles suited to entanglement, superposition, and qubit constraints. Professionals capable of framing problems in quantum logic, blending mathematics with computer science and physics, are increasingly valuable. These roles are not replacements for existing staff, but entirely new categories of expertise. They are appearing in research institutions, corporations, and startups alike. A related demand exists in hybrid systems integration. For many years to come, Businesses will rely on mixed infrastructures that combine classical and quantum computation. Engineers who can coordinate workloads, moving data seamlessly between classical processors and quantum units, will become central to operations. These skills are distinct from traditional IT competencies because they require thinking about computation in fundamentally different ways. Instead of tuning solely for clock cycles or memory bandwidth, hybrid specialists manage coherence times, error correction overheads, and algorithm partitioning between environments. That creates sustainable roles positioned at the crossover between two computational worlds. Domain specialists who can interpret quantum outputs are also becoming critical. Quantum machines do not necessarily deliver easily readable results. Their outputs are probability distributions requiring nuance and experience to analyze. In healthcare, for example, hospitals and research laboratories are preparing staff to handle molecular simulations informed by quantum results. In finance, analysts now train to interpret quantum-assisted risk portfolios. While the machines automate the calculation, it takes human judgment to translate those abstract distributions into practical insights. Far from making human specialists obsolete, this gives them larger interpretive responsibility. Importantly, industries and governments recognize the magnitude of this workforce transition. In 2025, training programs and university courses dedicated to quantum computing are emerging across multiple regions. Industry, university partnerships have launched courses covering algorithm design, quantum programming frameworks, and post-quantum security. Corporations, particularly in finance and energy, are piloting upskilling schemes that rotate staff across quantum projects, so future leaders grow comfortable with quantum-informed decision-making. These programs are documented trends and serve as early models for how broader sectors could structure their own workforce preparation. Healthcare again provides a visible case. While some anticipate that automated quantum tools will reduce the number of staff required for computational drug simulations, parallel initiatives are ensuring medical researchers are trained to examine, validate, and apply quantum-derived results. Interpreting outputs, adjusting trial parameters, and contextualizing findings within regulatory frameworks still depend on human oversight. In this sense, quantum computing redistributes effort. Time spent on lengthy computation is reduced, but responsibilities for understanding outputs expand. The pace of adoption, however, introduces challenges. Whenever technology advances faster than reskilling cycles, some workers risk being left behind. Even with training initiatives underway, mismatches between job reductions in one area and expansions in another take time to balance out. This transition phase is where disruptions will be most acutely felt. McKinsey and Deloitte reports highlight this as a predictable pattern. Employment does not vanish, but it shifts toward roles requiring updated expertise, and the readiness of reskilling programs determines how disruptive the shift feels on the ground. Geography further complicates the picture. Classical data centers are often concentrated in regions where physical space, energy, and economic incentives align. If quantum reduces the need for such massive facilities, local economies that once relied on these centers may face gradual contraction. Meanwhile, new opportunities in algorithm design or hybrid integration may flourish in research hubs located elsewhere. This uneven impact is why policy support and proactive reskilling programs are crucial. Without them, regions dependent on traditional computing infrastructure could feel disproportionate strain while growth occurs somewhere else. Most experts underscore a consistent theme: augmentation rather than replacement. In 2025, quantum processors like Willow require human researchers at every step. They extend capacity rather than automate full pipelines. Stability and power may shorten calculations, but deciding what problems to tackle, how to shape simulations, and how to act on the results is firmly in human hands. For now, quantum devices function as amplifiers, shifting workloads in ways that highlight human insight more intensely than before. Some contraction is inevitable. Lower demand for jobs linked to classical supercomputing clusters, less dependence on routine server oversight, and fewer tasks devoted to redesigning simplified models for classical compatibility are all likely. At the same time, distinctive new categories are rising: algorithm specialists, hybrid engineers, security experts, and interpreters of quantum outputs. The challenge is not whether job loss will dominate, but whether adaptation programs match technological speed, allowing workers to pivot before gaps widen. So when the question arises, will Willow replace us? The evidence points to a moderated answer. It is neither an immediate threat to employment nor a guarantee of seamless transition. It reshapes roles, compresses some categories, and creates entirely new ones, all while depending more heavily on people than headlines might suggest. Whether this becomes disruption or opportunity depends on how institutions manage reskilling, how workers adapt, and how policies support equitable change. That focus on adaptation naturally leads to a larger consideration. Beyond the workforce implications, many industries now want to know what happens next. The uncertainty is not just about who has the right skills, but about when these quantum systems will actually move from research prototypes into accessible tools for businesses and organizations. From lab to market, the road ahead. The question now is how Willow moves from being a record-setting research prototype to something companies can rely on as part of their operations. In 2025, this step is no longer hypothetical. Google has begun outlining a multi-year plan where Willow shifts from isolated lab experiments to a model of controlled commercial access, most likely delivered through cloud platforms. The shift is not just technical but structural. It requires building an ecosystem that makes quantum outputs dependable, secure, and usable for organizations far beyond physics labs. The earliest stage of that transition is already underway through pilot access programs. Instead of installing a quantum processor inside corporate facilities, select firms, especially in pharmaceuticals, finance, and energy, are connecting remotely to Willow within Google's environment under close supervision. These pilots are designed less as demonstrations of raw speed and more as tests of integration. They answer the question of how businesses can actually use Willow's results alongside existing classical frameworks. So far, feedback suggests that the main friction lies not inside the quantum chip itself, but in the translation layer, how to convert quantum probability distributions into formats business systems understand. Without that bridge, the chip's speed risks being wasted, because outputs cannot flow smoothly into an organization's regular software stack. Translation issues sit alongside infrastructure challenges. Willow's superconducting qubits require extreme conditions, cryogenic temperatures, shielding from interference, and careful calibration performed by expert teams. These conditions can be maintained in a research lab, but they are unrealistic to replicate in every corporate data center. That is why Google emphasizes cloud-based access as the likely model. Businesses will not buy their own Willow systems. They will lease access through secured cloud hubs. This approach lowers costs for industry, centralizes the expertise needed to maintain the machines, and standardizes how usage is billed. The processor itself becomes part of a package, complete with isolation and communication protocols that ordinary enterprises could never manage alone. Reliability is another decisive factor. In pilot use cases, such as climate modeling subcomponents or molecular interaction trials, Willow has shown sustained error-corrected calculations. But commercial customers will want to push broader, less optimized workloads, written by their own developers for problems with no neat experimental scaffolding. These open-ended tasks will strain Willow's architecture in new ways. Predictability matters as much as raw power. A financial firm cannot justify the expense if identical algorithms return inconsistent distributions. For this reason, Google's roadmap stresses not just hardware improvements, but also algorithm development, interface design, and support tools that help industries align their own software to quantum frameworks. Wider adoption depends as much on this surrounding software environment as on the chip itself. Networking also becomes critical. A pharmaceutical research group in one country may need to send requests to Willow hosted continents away. Results must travel quickly and securely. This raises two intertwined demands: minimizing latency and reinforcing communication security. It would be counterproductive if quantum breakthroughs accelerated simulations but left data vulnerable in transit. Post-quantum cryptography is expected to be integrated into these links by default, ensuring that communication pipelines are not the weak point. Cloud providers now consider quantum access not merely hardware hosting, but also the creation of secured gateways that deliver predictable availability. Beyond technology, economics decides whether adoption scales. Businesses calculate cost per computation, not benchmark prestige. Even if Willow operates dramatically faster than supercomputers, companies will not adopt it unless results are affordable compared to existing methods. This is why extended pilot programs track not only correctness but dollar efficiency. Pharmaceutical groups ask how much faster candidate compounds move to testing, and whether the savings outweigh access fees. Energy agencies model resource distribution while weighing costs against traditional simulations. The economic results of these pilots will ultimately steer how quickly commercial access expands. Early signs show certain sectors adapting quickly. Financial firms test risk models designed to run thousands of scenarios in parallel. Energy companies use pilot time on Willow to simulate grid imbalances more accurately. Pharmaceutical teams pursue binding affinities that classical hardware can only approximate. These are early experiments, but they confirm that specific problems align naturally with quantum outputs. Each successful run feeds confidence that Willow is not just a theoretical advantage, but a practical accelerator. Still, only a narrow set of industries currently has the expertise to participate. Quantum problem framing is specialized, requiring teams who can translate financial, chemical, or climate questions into structures a quantum chip can process. Few companies have this capacity today, which keeps adoption limited. A logistics business, for example, cannot yet submit a supply chain problem as a plain request and receive an actionable spreadsheet. It must first be restructured into an optimization sequence tailored for a quantum processor. Until user interfaces and algorithmic frameworks broaden, access will remain concentrated in research-heavy firms with technical staff ready to bridge the computational divide. This is why Google describes the transition as gradual over the next few years, rather than pointing to one fixed release year. The roadmap is a multi-stage build: pilot programs now, expanded cloud access as translation tools mature, and only later true enterprise offerings available to a wider market. Each phase depends on feedback from early users. The next milestones are not about crossing a calendar date, but about proving repeatability, lowering costs, and securing networks. Only with those elements in place will larger enterprises outside the scientific elite consider quantum access worth the investment. For businesses navigating this uncertain horizon, 3 practical steps stand out. The first is to participate in pilot programs where possible, or at least follow their published results. Early involvement provides exposure to the unique translation challenges of quantum outputs. The second is to begin building hybrid workflows. Organizations that experiment with dividing tasks between classical machines and quantum processors today will be better prepared when capacity expands. Hybrid infrastructure is not temporary. It will define operating models for years. And the third is to invest in post-quantum cryptography upgrades now. The migration timeline for securing communication outlasts the timeline for processor breakthroughs. Firms that delay will face vulnerabilities during the transition, no matter how powerful quantum services become. Seen from this perspective, the road ahead is less about unveiling a machine for mass purchase and more about cultivating a secure, functional service ecosystem. The reality is that Willow will not arrive as a stand-alone box on a corporate floor. It will arrive as cloud-hosted access behind reinforced infrastructure, wrapped in translation software, and supported by networks designed for resilience. The path to that point is measured not only by qubit counts, but by how seamlessly organizations can rely on those qubits as consistent tools. Each pilot program adds another layer to that foundation, and over the next several years, these layers will decide how fast the transition reaches broad commercial scale. The story thus far has focused on industries motivated by cost savings or security. But the same infrastructure that decides whether Willow becomes accessible to pharmaceutical or financial firms also sets the stage for other domains less tied to markets. Some researchers are looking beyond practical profit to much larger frontiers, questions not just about business modeling, but about the fundamental behavior of the universe itself. That perspective changes what is expected from a processor like Willow and expands the conversation into areas far removed from banks, labs, or energy grids. Why this matters to space enthusiasts. When conversations about Willow often focus on medicine, climate, or encryption, it is easy to overlook another frontier where quantum capability could carry deep implications: space. For space enthusiasts, the excitement comes from imagining how processors able to maintain entangled states and manage enormous branching probabilities might one day illuminate the mysteries of galaxies, black holes, or even the cosmic web itself. While Willow has not modeled astrophysical systems in practice, its performance in handling complex probabilistic workloads suggests why quantum computing is relevant for questions that stretch beyond Earth. Astrophysical modeling has always strained traditional supercomputers. Simulating the birth of a galaxy requires tracking how gas clouds collapse under gravity, how dark matter scaffolds the structure, and how billions of stars exchange energy across immense scales. Even the most advanced exascale facilities reduce these phenomena into coarse approximations, averaging countless processes to keep the problem workable. Quantum processors hint at a different path. Because qubits can exist in multiple states at the same time, they allow simulations to branch into parallel possibilities rather than smoothing them out into averages. This means that in principle, quantum systems could sustain far higher fidelity cosmological simulations than those available on classical machines. Willow's ability to run error-corrected entangled networks for longer durations highlights that this shift is no longer abstract. Such modeling might be practical when quantum hardware grows in scale. One area that captures attention is the study of black holes. These extreme environments lie at the intersection of quantum mechanics and general relativity, a junction notorious for defying current theories. Simulations of Hawking radiation, black hole evaporation, or entanglement across an event horizon push classical machines into breakdown because of the number of quantum states that must be represented. Early generation quantum systems cannot yet take on these puzzles fully, but Willow's evidence of scalable error suppression signals that processors may one day track entanglement structures precisely rather than approximating them. That prospect excites theorists because the physics of black holes is central to understanding whether our current frameworks can reconcile or whether new physics must be developed. The challenge of precision extends across cosmology. Models of the universe must simulate billions of years of evolution. Even numerical errors that look tiny at the beginning snowball across extended runs, forcing scientists to insert correction factors. While helpful, those corrections also distort outcomes. Quantum error correction, of the kind demonstrated below threshold on Willow, points toward the possibility of sustaining stable computations across far longer runs. For cosmology, That means fewer artificial constants and greater alignment with precise observations. The excitement for astrophysicists is not that Willow has already achieved this, but that its architecture demonstrates a mechanism that could make decades-long or billion-year simulations reliable in the future. Gravitational waves provide a concrete example of what better modeling could deliver in practice. Since the first direct detection in 2015, astronomers have relied on enormous libraries of template waveforms to match against signals from black hole or neutron star collisions. But as detectors improve, the parameter space of possible waveforms expands faster than classical systems can cope with. Generating and storing thousands of high-resolution patterns becomes computationally overwhelming. A stable quantum processor could in theory create these libraries more efficiently, producing accurate waveforms at a scale beyond today's limits. Such a capability would make gravitational wave astronomy sharper, letting researchers test theories against data at a speed closer to real time rather than months later. Attention also falls on the cosmic web, the massive filamentary structure that extends across intergalactic space. It links galaxies into clusters and clusters into superclusters through delicate gravitational balances. Simulating the web requires full multi-scale treatment, structures billions of light-years long emerging from interactions on local, atomic levels. No classical machine can sustain that granularity. Quantum systems, because of their ability to encode multiple states simultaneously, hint at a way to track this hierarchy without collapsing it into statistical averages. Again, Willow has not done this modeling, but its entanglement-driven performance is precisely why astrophysicists see quantum power as a new instrument for approaching these challenges. Beyond simulation, quantum technology also connects to observation. Space telescopes gather more data than researchers can parse rapidly. Light curves, spectra, and gravitational lensing maps all push analytic pipelines to the edge of capacity. Quantum processors could accelerate the comparison of theoretical predictions against inflowing data, compressing timelines from months to perhaps days. As instruments like next-generation observatories produce torrents of information, quantum acceleration would make model-based analysis possible at a pace that matches new discoveries. If large sets of telescope data could be parsed efficiently, theories about dark matter distribution or the origins of galactic rotation curves might be tested continually rather than periodically. These computational ambitions are not occurring in isolation. Agencies like NASA have already begun exploring quantum relevance in space. Experiments with ultra-cold quantum sensors placed in space environments, such as atom interferometers, are underway, testing whether quantum states can enhance measurements of gravitational fields or navigation accuracy without GPS. The logic is similar. Quantum systems provide sensitivity classical sensors cannot match. Paired with processors like Willow, a future space mission might both sense the universe with finer detail and model it with unprecedented accuracy. The combination of quantum sensing and quantum simulation opens the possibility of studying cosmic behavior in ways no previous generation of instruments could. For enthusiasts, the appealing part is how quantum computing changes the scale of what feels possible to ask. Until recently, simulating an entire galaxy or mapping the evolution of black holes was acknowledged as beyond reach. Willow's architectural breakthrough does not change that overnight, but it shows clear progress toward machines that can carry quantum systems from physics experiments to astrophysical relevance. Each demonstration of stability on Earth hints at how, with expansion, those capabilities may be repurposed for cosmic questions. The excitement comes less from solved mysteries than from credible pathways to attempt simulations that were dismissed for decades. Another inspiration can be found in the interplay with telescope missions. Researchers know theory must be compared against observation. As quantum processors mature, astronomers will not have to choose between running simplified models or waiting long stretches for simulations to complete. They could test new hypotheses against observational data far more quickly. In practice, this means being able to ask sharper questions. How exactly do galaxies bind within the cosmic web? What role does dark energy play in structure formation? Could subtle signals buried in gravitational waves reveal new states of matter? Quantum machines do not answer these yet, but they increase the probability that answers are reachable. This convergence of curiosity and capacity makes Willow's role relevant for more than specialists. Enthusiasts who follow space exploration or cosmology understand that computation is the hidden engine behind every new discovery. Telescopes reveal the light, but it takes simulation and modeling to explain what the light means. Quantum power expands that interpretive space, allowing astronomy to test more theories, check more patterns, and reframe fundamental questions in physics itself. Even limited-scale breakthroughs suggest that humanity could pursue astrophysical answers once thought permanently beyond reach. In the broader sense, Willow symbolizes a bridge between Earth-centered applications and cosmic ones. It illustrates how the same tools designed to accelerate climate research or drug discovery could also provide entry points into galactic dynamics or black hole physics. That dual role makes it compelling for anyone who looks upward to the stars. For the community of space enthusiasts, it highlights the possibility that quantum computing may soon be as integral to space science as rockets or telescopes. The experiments we see in 2025 are still preliminary, but their relevance stretches wide. They highlight how every advancement in managing fragile quantum systems has consequences for the largest systems in nature: stars, galaxies, and the universe itself. What once felt like speculation now looks like a roadmap, and that realization reframes how scientists and enthusiasts alike think about progress. Framed this way, Willow is more than a benchmark chip. It is an early stepping stone toward instruments capable of simulating cosmic structures and interpreting astronomical data at the highest fidelity possible. The excitement it generates comes not from having already unlocked galactic secrets, but from showing that the once impossible may soon fall within range. And as space enthusiasts weigh what these developments mean, they connect to a larger story that stretches across all fields of science. What happens when quantum progress stops being potential and becomes an active force shaping discovery itself? Willow's progress in 2025 underscores that quantum computing has moved beyond theory into practical science. Google's 105-qubit benchmarks in random circuit sampling showed separation from classical hardware, while its below-threshold error correction claims demonstrated that stability can improve as systems grow. These results establish a foundation where experiments in climate modeling, pharmaceutical research, and cryptographic preparedness now run on hardware once thought too fragile for sustained use. The implications are serious, but so is the promise. As quantum pilots expand, the balance of risk and opportunity will define how society adapts. Which scientific mystery would you most want a quantum computer to tackle? Climate, drug discovery, or the cosmos? Share your answer in the comments.